Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm excited to get the opportunity to speak to you about the changes that the U.S. energy market is experiencing. We have a couple of fantastic experts with us, Denise Martin with GCF and Kevin Hagen with Pilchuck Consulting, who you get the chance to hear from shortly. They spent their careers helping businesses navigate forward-thinking strategies with regards to energy and sustainability. And given the current outlook for volatility and disruption in the U.S. energy market, I'm appreciative of the time that they've afforded us to talk about their experiences and how they're planning in this current dynamic landscape. I am Mike Kushner, a 15-year renewable energy executive, currently serving in the role of the general manager for Aggreko IPP C&I USDG business. I've spent the last decade and a half focused on development, financing, and execution of DG projects across the U.S. So who is Aggreko? Founded in 1962, Aggreko is a global leader in modular and mobile energy solutions. Our business supports industries in over 80 countries, and we're long considered an expert in rapid deployment and resilient distributed energy systems. IPPS is the business unit within Aggreko that is focused on long-term renewable energy. And our focus really is to develop on-site solar, battery, and hybrid systems. Our primary goal is to help C&I and municipal customers reduce cost, carbon, and grid dependency by providing scalable, flexible, and reliable energy solutions. So as we think about today's energy landscape in the U.S. and why we've sort of focused on framing this as disruption, and you may hear me say volatility a few times here in this webinar today, makes you think about a few of the key indicating factors that are really driving what we're seeing and analysts are seeing as a disruptive environment. And so when we think about it, we'll go into these in a little bit more detail as we progress, but we're really seeing the fastest demand growth in the last 2 to 3 decades here in the U.S. A lot of that is driven by various circumstances, which we'll dive into in the additional slides here. We also have some grid constraints. There's transmission shortages. There's been a lack of investment in the U.S. in the infrastructure, which have led to aging infrastructure as well as interconnection queue delays. As we all know, especially in the current climate, there's policy transitions. There's been regulatory landscape changes over the last 12 to 14 months. We've heard of the IRA previously. We've now shifted to an environment that includes now the OBBB and current policy. We have shifting dynamics at state levels that are sometimes aligned and sometimes not aligned with federal policy coming out of DC. And additional regulations when it comes to environmental and various other departmental agencies that either can create tailwinds or headwinds for the focus on driving forward energy transitions and solutions. Excuse me. So data centers, as we all know, we've heard this, and anybody that's in the energy sort of landscape or within their industry focused on energy and sustainability, data centers are driving unprecedented growth right now. As you can see, this is a good illustration if we look at this screen right now, where over the last 2.5 decades, we've remained relatively flat. When we pause and think about this, if we step back and we think about the economy in the United States at large, in this period, even preceding 1990 on our screen, we had manufacturing and an industrial economy that was really driving a lot of the electrification. We had the suburbanization of the populace, and so there was growth in electricity, demand and consumption that aligned with that. From the middle period here, where you see a bit of a flat or a stagnation, a lot of that was really driven, as you can imagine, through energy efficiency focuses, as well as the offshoring of manufacturing and industrial uses here in the United States as an economic driver. When we get into the tail period here and we start to look at the current 2020 to 26 landscape and beyond, we know that AI and the digitization of our economy are going to be the key drivers and key indicators that are going to continue to progress the need for energy demand and consumption across the country. When we think about that proliferation of digital needs and digital focus in our country, there's a geographic element to it as well. We are seeing obviously hot load zones in Texas, California, the Midwest, and the Northeast. Much of this, as you can imagine, aligns with the population centers within our country and where the demand will ultimately come from. However, we also are experiencing some remigration in our country, right, in terms of the U.S. populace. And so while generationally we have folks that are starting to move potentially out of historically populous centers, they're moving to warmer weather climates and areas of that sort of nature that are providing us with a distribution of energy consumption that is shifting dramatically. Historically, we see on our screen here what has really been driving the new electric generation capacity in our country. And so when we go back over the same 20-year period, 30-year period that we were just talking about in terms of growth followed by stagnation or plateau, and then moving into increased capacity demand again, historically we see the shift to renewables between 2010 up through the current period. Some of the key drivers here, as we all may consider and be aware of, we had policy shifts. We had a focus on ESG. We had focuses from both the state and the federal policies coming out of DC to drive our economy in that way. While we see this trend increasing over time, like any growth trend, there will be periods of peaks and valleys. And so while we may have some headwinds currently that are also creating some disruption in terms of policy and tax incentives, we are focused on the overall continued growth of a shift towards renewables and an ability for folks and businesses to control their energy sort of destiny. One thing to consider as we look at strategic planning and the go forward for businesses and consumers of energy is the geography. Not all ISOs are created equal, right? So there's a regional component that is following some of the load growth that I mentioned previously with regards to the data center and AI proliferation in regional hotbeds, as well as then the populace sort of shifting around the country. The implications for this and the dynamics for energy consumers could be compartmentalized into a few key components. Planning early for interconnection, grid constraints, expecting load growth in regions where we currently operate and where you currently operate your businesses, consideration of on-site generation where feasible. These are ways that you can control your destiny with regards to cost and with cost and resiliency within your energy profile. Understanding long-term trends in the electrification and industrial load and energy availability is really becoming a site selection factor, as developers well know. When we think about growth in our businesses, in your businesses, we think about where we will be in positions that the demand for our energy will be able to be served by the utilities. Oops, sorry. So why have renewables been such a deciding factor in growing our new electric generating capacity? One of the key components here is cost. Obviously, energy is something that everyone thinks about. It comes down to cost. We're talking about availability, reliability, redundancy, and all these sorts of hot topics. But from a levelized cost of energy, renewables have led the class. When you look at some of the reports and the data out there, renewables anywhere from 3.5 to 8 cents per kilowatt hour, whereas you get into natural gas, combined cycle, peaker gas plants, these types of generating assets are anywhere from 4.5 upwards of 26 cents a kilowatt hour. So given the policy shifts and ESG focuses, at the end of the day, cost rules the day, and levelized cost of energy from renewable resources has historically now, as we start to collect the data over the last 20 years, has become the low cost provider. Second consideration is speed to deployment. We have a little bit of a convergence, right? An inflection point, a little bit of a juxtaposition here where we have this increasing demand and capacity needs across the country from the previous, for the aforementioned reasons. However, when we think about the speed to deploy generating assets, historically, utility scale solar, onshore wind, natural gas, combined cycle, peaker gas plants, nuclear, nuclear plants. These all have multi-year development and deployment durations. When we think about on-site solar generation, it's very contrary to a lot of the other asset generation resources that are out there. On-site solar is anywhere from a year to a year and a half on the high side. When we look at nuclear plants, we all know those are 8 to 12 year cycles. Peaker gas plants are anywhere from 2 to 4 years. And so when we think about the cost being the lowest, the levelized cost of energy being lowest with renewable resources, as well as the speed to deploy, these are both decided factors that have aided in what we see on this graph here today, why new generation assets, electricity generation assets have been renewable over the last 15 years. So the counter side, or the counterbalance to that, when we look at this here, I think that sometimes there's an unintentional or a misguided compartmentalization, right, of DG asset deployment from the renewable perspective and the need for infrastructure investment. And so when we go back and we think about the growth in capacity and demand and usage 25 years ago, growth, you can see that it somewhat aligns with some of the infrastructure investment that the country has undertaken. And then we went through this period of stagnation, and we also did not see the investment from the U.S. right into our infrastructure from utilities, and there just has not been that investment. And so now we get to this point where, as I said, an inflection point, we're at a crossroads a bit. And so when we think about this demand that is imminent and this capacity surge need that is imminent with the digitization of our economy, there's going to need to be a rapid deployment of infrastructure increasing as well. If there isn't, then we're going to be in a position where we're going to be lagging. The demand for energy will lag, given the need that, given the lack of investment that we're seeing. And so the question, begs the question a bit: why is there a lag in investment in infrastructure? Couple of points here, right? I think one is it's expensive. It's expensive, and so we know that utilities they're balance sheet driven, right? And so they're not going to deploy infrastructure unless it's an absolute necessity. There's a bit of a reactive nature to the utility space rather than proactive. And so historically, we've seen that growth stagnate with the lack of capacity and demand increase, the necessity to increase infrastructure with the lack of growth in the energy consumption in this country. And so at this point, we know that this is imminent. And so we need to start to see some of that coming forward. One way to offset this, obviously, is through distributed generation resources, right? They historically have a much shorter time frame to deploy. We've talked about the cost. They also are not as subjected to the intricacies or the complexities that come with some of the larger electricity generation asset interconnection process. When we're talking about distributed generation, it typically is the simplest form and the simplest process with utilities, and also often the quickest. And while none of it is fully predictable in terms of cost, as you look at your pro formas to get generating assets online, they typically and more often than not are somewhat more predictable than some of the other generating assets that may be out there. Before I kick it over to Denise, one thing I would say is that in this period of volatility and some disruption, I would say that even with the policy that we're seeing over the last year come out that could create the perception of tremendous headwinds to the renewable industry, I think that there are some tailwinds that we should consider. All right, and being in the industry, this is the way that we've been thinking about it, even preceding the passing of the OBBB. We've continued to see sort of the falling renewable technology costs. So if anyone has been in the industry that I'm in for 10, 15, 20 years, we saw panels and modules that were 80, 90 cents. Those continue to drop routinely as technology improves. I think that the onshoring of domestic manufacturing, which is driving some of the energy demand, is also going to help us potentially drive down costs as we get some of that product manufactured here at home. We've seen advances in storage and grid software. These types of technological advancements will absolutely help us in driving cost and efficiencies. And then there's been an increased market competition. What I mean by that is, as the industry for renewables continues to mature, our competitiveness with the other historically deployed generating assets is it's evident. And so for these reasons, I think that even in the light of some of the headwinds we see from the OBBB, we do have tailwinds as an industry at large to continue to deploy DG assets. Okay, Denise Martin, Global Cellulose Fibers.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I am going to give you my perspective from a large manufacturer perspective. I have 30 plus years of industry experience working in the pulp and paper industry. I'm an engineer by training, came up through the mill system so that I could really understand how we go about making our products, how energy is used, how it affects the different unit operations and what we do. And over time, I was able to actually manage one of our large manufacturing sites with electrical generation and distribution as a part of that. So if you think about our business, the pulp and paper industry, if you've ever seen one of our mills, they're quite large. When you think about it, our portfolio across our pulp and containerboard business is large enough to support, for instance, a city of 1.2, 1.3 million people. So it's a pretty good size of generation that we have internal to our needs. And depending on the business, we can be, mostly self-sourced electrical generation. So that's my background. As a part of that, we also have consumers, our final product customers that expect us to continue to move to a less carbon intensive operating posture. And so this presentation is really going to be to speak to that kind of relationship. And so when we think about that, your company is probably going to start with some kind of a greenhouse gas reduction goal. And so if you think about that goal and where you are in your particular journey, in my experience, that success or failure of your ability to meet that target depends on a number of various things, including planning, the alignment of your business relative to its vision and priorities, and then how your teams internal to your business go about executing on that plan. So you got to have a communications plan. People need to understand what that overall goals are, what that goal is, and how you intend to achieve that goal. You got to make sure that you have appropriate teams and that people are appropriately aligned to these items. And then any goal or target is worth having metrics. So you need to understand what your baseline is. You need to understand where you want to go. And then, of course, the biggest component and one of the things that our company has always said is that work gets done through our people. So you have to make sure that you're recognizing those human factors because it is one of the key components of how you're going to move forward. So as we think about these particular items and think about the human side of what we do, you have to make sure that as you're moving forward with these perspectives, you are really looking at, does your senior leadership have buy-in, right? You want to make sure that they are truly motivated, that they understand the reasons why you want to move forward in these paths, and that it makes good business sense. If you think about those competing priorities, the businesses are always looking at what is the financial perspective, because you can't do work that's going to put you out of business. You can make yourself 100% green, but then you might also not be able to maintain your manufacturing structure. So understanding those competing priorities and the timing of those particular things and how you can move forward are really important. If you don't have clear vision, and if your leaders or the people that are assigned to participate and to engage and help lead these particular items, these efforts to reduce your carbon footprint, for example, if there's not clear vision, it can lead to huge amounts of frustration and wasted work. And so you want to make sure that as you move forward, you really have the appropriate level of buy-in to move forward with the tasks that you have. The last thing that I would say is that in this regard is that you really have to recognize the risk. So Mike mentioned a couple of them around the political risk, around the manufacturing, the financial components. There are many different items that you have to be aware of. And as a large manufacturer that has facilities, and I've worked with the facilities across the United States, understanding the political perspective is really significantly important. So as you're setting up your goal, you need to understand what your GHGs are. You know, where does your facility, how does your business contribute to those greenhouse gas emissions, if that is your goal? And how can you effectively manage those? So in many cases, people, when they started working on their greenhouse gas reductions, they focused on scope 1 and scope 2, which is the middle, which is sandwiched, if you will, by the outside components, which are your upstream and your downstream supply chain. So if you think about all of the raw material inputs, you think about the outputs and how you actually move your product to customer, all of that becomes part of your supply chain, part of your overall greenhouse gas impact. But there are only certain things that you can truly control, which is the scope 1, scope 2 internal to your operation. And so understanding what those are, really understanding what your contribution is to each of those is really key and really important. And so as we think about these perspectives and how you're going to think about your greenhouse gas input, you have to kind of recognize and say, what are my influences? Where are those areas that I really have to pay attention to? And so I really like this particular chart of the United States that is updated on a regular basis. This study, this group comes out of the University of North Carolina, and they have been publishing this information about renewable energy portfolio standards, which are really the legislation that's driving the changes across the United States. Also, you have markets that are regulated and unregulated on both the electricity side and the natural gas side. And those things can influence how you can go to market in these areas to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. So as Mike said, it's a complicated space. It's not something that you necessarily want to go alone, and you want to make sure that you have the right business partners in order to help you with this. This is just an example of the various things that you have to be aware of. And when you look across this picture, you can see how varied it really is. And if you're managing a very large portfolio, you got to be aware of and have the right business partners across this entire spectrum of different areas and different opportunities. With each RPS, with each state RPS, there are going to be different opportunities for you to participate in. And so you really need to think about, how am I going to be able to influence what I can do internal to my company, and what are the levers or benefits that I can get from external parties as part of the legislative environment. So when we started working on our scope 1, scope 2, scope 1 is easy. It's the easiest way to make an impact in terms of systems that are readily available for us to deploy. So if I think about it, the first block already renewable energy resources, and these are kind of what I consider indirect contributions. So you're going to get passive improvements through your utility as they continue to work on lowering their own carbon footprint. Many of the states that I showed you in that last map have community solar programs as part of their reduction, and those are very cost-effective ways. They can be very cost-effective ways to be able to start to influence the carbon footprint in your local operating area. It's a really good way to tell the story that meets your local requirements and participates in your local grid. Other future pathways that can be available include the virtual purchase power agreements, the VPPAs. It includes the solar behind the meter and battery storage, which Mike spoke about. It includes, for us, we generate a lot of our own power. All of our large manufacturing mills are certified as renewable energy generators across the United States. And so we have a very large REC program. We can trade and sell in that market, which has grown tremendously in the last 10 plus years. And then we also can look at the basic things that are going on. So powered industrial trucks, right? The safety and the reliability around battery systems, around the environmental compliance of these systems. We've done a huge amount of work to understand that and to be able to support using a powered industrial truck in a manufacturing environment that runs 24/7. So all of these things can influence what you need to do based on how your facility runs. And then we've also looked at carbon sequestration. So when you think about these particular attributes, using the guidance that you've gotten from your senior leaders, from your organization, you can then decide which are the right perspectives for us to take on. Then you need to create that plan. You have to start with that good planning. That was the very beginning of the success or failure. So you have to make sure that you have the right business groups, that you have the right people to work with, an appropriate perspective about, are they helping you get to where you need to go? Or is there a different organization or benefit that your customer is driving, to find the right business partner, internal or external? And from our perspective, for us, it was really around finding that first good win and making sure that we had a structure that we could support and that would be supported by our business. And so if I look at that the next slide here, I'm going to give you a few perspectives, and hopefully it's going to advance for me. Give you a few perspectives on what that first good win could look like. And again, you have to have buy-off by your senior leadership in order to move these things forward. So in this chart, I've just tried to identify, for example, for us, what our journey looked like. So if I started in the first half of 2022 looking at these goals and trying to set up what that looks like for us, I got the buy-in from our business, our supply chain partners by the end of the year, back half of the year, got approval to move forward on several of the strategies. It still has to go through our own internal process. So for instance, on the VPPAs, we did not have success with those, and that project got stopped in the early part of 2023. But the large solar behind the meter, we continue to have increments of success there, and hopefully we'll have a large array come online in 2027 to help us meet our goals. In the community solar, we found right business partners for us that allowed us to have relatively low financial risk in taking on those kinds of agreements. So we have multiples of those contracts that we've been able to deploy. And then, of course, we've looked at rooftop solar. So any kind of solar behind, because you get the lower cost of power, you're able to protect yourself from some of those higher costs that Mike mentioned earlier. And as Mike said, these are shorter duration projects. So from the time that you begin to the time that you actually deploy, you can get some of these done in up to 24 months. All of this depends on, of course, the buy-in from your senior leaders and the business. So that's just a quick introduction. There are lots of different things to think about. And I like to use this as the pieces of the puzzle. So you're going to bring each of these pieces together in order to support what you and your company want to do as you continue to deploy your greenhouse gas reduction. So I'm going to turn this over to Kevin, and he's going to speak about his experience in the consulting side of this world.
Thank you so much. Both Mike, thanks for setting the table, and Denise, thanks for sharing some great personal insights and experience. You've covered a lot of territory, and I don't know if the success of your program is obvious in your slides, but you guys have really achieved a tremendous amount. I want to just pick that up a little bit and take it from there. Just me, currently I'm leading a sustainability consulting activity called Pilchuck Consulting. Previously, I led the sustainability strategy at REI, the outdoor co-op, and at Iron Mountain, the data center data storage company, where we had a lot of experience in a number of aspects of sustainable business strategy implementation. including clean energy, greenhouse gas reductions. And so I wanted to share a few things there and a few things of what I've seen from others. Part of the process has been to collaborate heavily with others. We recognize that we're not big enough to make a big enough difference or to set the table ourselves. So I worked a lot through an organization called the Clean Energy Buyers Association and ended up actually leading that group in Washington. Because CEBA, if you don't already know it, I highly recommend a quick look at that to see if CEBA meets a need that your organization might have. It's about the top 400 largest energy buyers in the country today. CEBA's membership buys enough electricity to be a top 20 or 25 country in the world. And what's interesting about, I think, the group is that they're working together not only to solve their own clean energy, reliability, cost issues for themselves, but to collaborate together and help drive change across the grid, trying to develop a more reliable, more resilient, cost-effective, clean grid for everyone. That experience has led me to the opportunity to see inside a lot of organizations and how they're doing this across a number of industries, from retail to real estate to the data center groups. And I'd love to share a little bit. My outdoor experience, I think, comes in a little bit. My philosophy to my consulting practice these days is to be similar to what I experienced with mountain guides, trying to take folks places they would have never gone before by themselves and come home alive. That's my effort. It might set the stage for big changes happening in the industry. Absolutely, it's clear. I would say there are more change in the utility grid environment in the last 5 years than maybe in the previous 50 years combined. It's an incredible disruption happening. I picked a bunch of headlines just to kind of all over the map of things happening. One of the things that I think is important to notice is that a lot of the headlines and a lot of the data that we shared here are things like EIA averages the whole country or the whole world, but certainly the whole country, looking across what load growth looks like. That's averaged out across the entire organization, across the entire world. Where you're experiencing, what your facilities experience is entirely local. What's happening at your utility, your state regulator, your local substation. If there's a data center being built down the street from you, your load growth profile is going to be a whole lot different than US average. I also think that while data centers get a lot of attention because they're big chunks of energy consumption, the overall trend of load growth is here to stay. For example, let's just take electric vehicles, for example. What if it takes 20 years to convert all the fuel that we're currently buying at the pump to electricity via electric vehicles? Well, converting the fuel that we buy today, even though electric vehicles are 3 to 5 times more efficient than ICE vehicles, it still would take around 2,000 terawatt hours a year of electricity to convert all that fuel to electricity. Well, Mike's data said that our total electricity consumption in the country is 4,100 terawatt hours. So 50% load growth over those years is just EVs. Add in heat pumps, changing natural gas to electricity, and oh, by the way, data centers. And we see that the load growth profile across the country is here to stay. In fact, if we took 20 years to change to electric vehicles, it would be 5% change per year. 5% of 2,000 terawatt hours is 100 terawatt hours. 100 terawatt hours is 2.5% load growth just by itself. So and we know that it's not going to happen linearly. So we got a massive disruption happening in the marketplace. What does that mean to you? And how should we react? My advice is taking 5 steps from the internal perspective, from you as the person, protagonist in the organization, who is the one who sees this coming. You may likely be the only one who sees this coming, because we have been incredibly successful at making electricity into a commodity, in fact, out of sight, out of mind. In fact, the utility industry has been super reliable, affordable, and ubiquitous, such that we don't even think about making an electricity purchase for most companies. Okay, look, if you're a aluminum smelter, it's a strategic purchase. You know exactly what's happening on that wire and why that wire and that substation is coming into your facility. But the rest of us, we wouldn't even list electricity as a critical input to our business. Right? It's like oxygen in the room. When you list the contents of the room, nobody says oxygen, but we'd notice if it wasn't there. And in fact, today, knowing that there's this massive disruption in the electricity market is a critical piece of information. We have to move our organizational thinking, organizational competency from a commodity, out of sight, out of mind procurement to actually a strategic purchase of the business. That's a huge lift in and of itself, and you can't do it by yourself. Think about other strategic purchases in the organization, critical inputs to your business. Everybody understands. If you're a textile manufacturer, you understand cotton, and everybody on the plant knows, and the CFO knows where your cotton comes from. If you're a retailer today, you probably don't know how much electricity you buy or why it's crucial, where it's coming from. The excuse to go hunt for greenhouse gas emissions was really effective, in my experience, as a reason, quote, in air quotes, to go find that data. Understanding how much you use, where it's coming from, who's buying it, and why is a super valuable piece of information for you, because that's where it starts. Understanding the data will set, as I've said to my colleagues before, the data shall set you free. Once you have the data, evaluate where you are. And we can talk a little bit about more of that in a minute, but what are your constraints? Data centers understand that it's a constraint to build a new data center if they can't get the power. But the rest of us, imagine trying to expand your store and being told by the utility that you can't get power for 2 years. Now you can't expand in that location. That's a terrible piece of news if you've already counted on it because you've never really imagined a constraint in electricity supply before. Well, that's exactly what's happening to stores like a Walmart, who can't build a new store or can't expand the parking lot or can't add EV charging stations because the utility can't provide power or is unwilling to provide power to your facility anytime soon. Oh my goodness, that's now we're in the CFO's office and not in a good way. So building an understanding and organizational competency around electricity supply is pretty important before it becomes pretty important. Building that coalition of internal advocates around the topic and building your organizational competency is critical to success. You can't be the only one who knows what's going on. You got to build coalition of the willing inside your organization who understand the risks, not necessarily in a I'm just trying to scare everybody way, but understand the risks from we need to get smart from a business perspective about our electricity procurement and how, where, who, how much. And then I know this sounds strange because it would have always sounded strange to me before I worked in the space of advocacy, but get a handle on who your advocacy group is, your government affairs team. After you spend about 2 years on electricity understanding, you're gonna find out that it all goes back to policy, and policy is blocking an awful lot of opportunity for our businesses. Denise showed a graph of the mandates around the country for clean energy. Turns out from our SEBA data that clean energy is actually being driven more by voluntary purchases by corporations than by mandates. In fact, states like Texas didn't show up on her map, yet Texas is a huge opportunity for clean energy and is driving tremendous change in their grid for cleaner energy, but also for more cost-effective, reliable energy because it's renewable. Complete mind shift around what's happening. So For example, rather than advocating for new mandates for electricity or new green energy mandates, what we really need to be mandating is open the door and let us fix our problem and give us access to market opportunities like we have in Texas to be able to drive change as big customers. So sooner or later, you're going to find out that your advocacy team is a critical part of your team making things happen in the organization. Well, if those are 5 actions that you ought to take, let's think about maybe 5 questions that you could grapple with as you kind of work across the organization. First thing is, if you're going to move from this ubiquitous, out of sight, out of mind procurement to a strategic goal in the business, you got to understand your goals. So are you trying to get low carbon power? Are you worried about price of power today? Or maybe it's you need price stability. You'd actually pay a little bit above market today if you knew that it was going to be the same price for the next 5 years. There's a whole lot that goes into the goal setting, and it's not just you, right? You have to build the organizational awareness of what are we trying to get done here, because if they don't know what you're trying to get done, it really doesn't matter what you do. So building an organizational idea of shared goals matters a lot. What are your constraints? So you don't have cash? Well, wait, you don't have infinite cash and an incredibly good grant or a loan profile? Oh, I guess we don't all work for Google. So where do you go? What's going on? So not only are the financial constraints an issue, but other constraints. For example, your facilities. Do you have room to move? Do you have roof space? Do you have good roofs or bad roofs? An example of assets that you might not have seen coming was we had a facility in New Jersey where our next door neighbor was a sod farm. Why is that an asset? Well, it turns out that they had a lot of space. We ended up they built on our behalf a multi-megawatt solar array, ran the wire across the fence, and somehow we convinced the utility that that was behind the meter. Huge opportunity, really great investment, wonderful financial and clean energy decision, but really out of the box thinking from the point of view of what were our assets and what were we working with. For example, maybe you would think that it's a constraint that you're on a really constrained local grid, or that the local substation is near max. Now you can't expand the business because the local substation is near max. Well, actually, that's a great place for a battery. So maybe you're actually thinking about building, you would think about a new approach to putting a solar array and a huge battery in that site, not only for your for your needs, but now you actually, that facility could get paid to be an asset to the local grid. Hey, that takes a lot of utility engagement and a whole lot of creative thinking, maybe some new business models. But that's the open door of moving electricity from out of sight to strategic. It really opens the door to what kind of new options do you really have? And it really speaks to what kind of new partnerships do you have to build? Neighbors, suppliers, the utility, a whole new array of help is available. It's really about shifting our thinking from design constraints, risks, scarcity, to opportunities. How do we think about the business in a new way that brings new opportunities? A wonderful example here is the company Prologis, largest owner-operator of distribution centers and other industrial facilities. They've actually recognized that it's an asset to their client, their tenant, to have reliable, low-cost electricity. So they've become one of the largest solar owners in the country because they are putting solar on the roof and selling the power as part of the package to their tenant. Completely new business unit that emerged from out of nowhere, because they were thinking differently about their energy portfolio as part of the solution instead of part of the problem. Well, that was a really quick recap of 5 things that you should think about and 5 questions you should be answering, helping your organization and helping you personally lead the idea from a set of out of sight, out of mind stuff that nobody's paying attention to a strategic procurement, to an asset to your business. And hopefully this session can help you make some of those inroads or open some of the opportunities that help you think about that. Mike, maybe we got some questions or something from the audience.
Yeah, no, Kevin, Denise, both, thank you very much. Just a multitude of information there. And I think, obviously advantageous for folks to hear the experience that you both have had from essentially, as you framed it, getting your first win to thinking about the questions and then how to take action. So I think right before we jump into the questions here, right, one thought is what makes the right partner, the right teams in general. And I think, the underlying tone or theme is essentially you're looking for strategic energy advisory services in a partner. And you're looking for a group that has a cross-functional experience, not only in markets and geographies, but in the various ways in which you can control your energy sort of destiny based on what's best for your organization and not necessarily what's best for them and their perspective of what their core business is. So I think flexibility in that regard would resonate with most of the organizations that are out there. So we do have some questions in the chat here. So here's a good one. So when building your internal team to get things moving and out of the gate, what makes for the best partners? And so I'll get both of your input here in a moment, but I think as I read the question, I'm thinking about, so an organization is considering the ways in which they could potentially move forward with renewable development as an advantage. And so I think for me, it's really making sure, and you guys both touched on this, is cross-functional buy-in, right? And so we talked about, and I heard the reference to stakeholders and having folks all be aware and communicating internally to know what's going on. I think it's important to make sure that that's cross-functional. The consideration, development, and execution of a renewable energy project, it requires everything from safety to facilities management to finance and everything in between. So I think having cross-functional buy-in is important. Kevin, it looks like you may have a thought here as well.
I'll let Denise go first. I bet she's had some fabulous experience actually getting stuff done.
So in our experience, I think internal to your organization, there are certain rules or policies that have to be followed in order to maintain your compliance. And understanding those environmental resources, Mike, you mentioned the safety side, but understanding the financial components as well, in terms of what is the process that you actually have to go through in order to get a project done? And can you answer all of the questions that are associated with change? So in my experience, the more you educate the people that have to approve the project and continue to work and socialize, that's what we call it inside of our company, socialize the project opportunity and how it brings value across the business. And then you have to make sure that relative to those internal structures, you understand each approval point, each approval delegation of authority, if you will, in order to get those projects completed. Because you may have really good buy-in at the bottom, but if they're not the ones that actually sign the bottom line, you're not going to get to move forward. And so in some of the work, in the example that I used for the VPPA, we did a huge amount of work, thought we had the right resources, but when it came down to that last commitment, we did not have it. So we spent 8 months working on a strategy that, had we gone to the right resources at the very beginning, we would have learned very quickly that there wasn't senior leadership buy-in for that kind of a contract structure. They felt it was too risky, et cetera. And so it made us really redirect and think about what could we do on our own properties as opposed to using different resources. Understanding
we may have lost Denise. Looks like she may have frozen.
No, and she said that what she was saying was perfect as well.
And she was dropping fantastic information for everyone. I think, Go ahead, Kevin.
So I just pick up where she left off. I think that so I think a key takeaway is this. In fact, most of you have probably already experienced this. It really doesn't matter if you have the answer unless someone asks you the question. So spending our time up front trying to build the coalition, build the knowledge, build the information amongst other key stakeholders in the business, other key decision makers, so that they actually understand and maybe even ask the question, hey, what are we doing about energy problems, right? Now, A, it really helps when they ask the question. B, it really helps if you anticipate the question and knew it was coming, right? Don't be surprised. So with so much energy information on the news every day, it is coming, right? The question is finally coming. Many people in the energy space have been working in the back room for years, maybe their entire career, have never seen the CFO's office, don't know where it is, right? Now, all of a sudden, our utility bills are a strategic issue to the business, and somebody high up is asking us the right question. Be ready. Let's have some answers. And I think the creative opportunities that are out there today, whether it's on-site facilities, a combination of the neighborhood and a mini grid, or a complex procurement structure like a virtual power purchase agreement, all bring an entirely new suite of opportunities to us as practitioners that really open some doors to some great outcomes. Again, know your goals, make sure everybody understands the same goals so that your solution is actually delivering what the organization wants. But I think that's the crux of it, is helping build people across the business. I think in the first virtual power purchase agreement that Iron Mountain ever executed back in, 2014, 2015, it took 7 vice presidents around the table all saying yes. Now, I don't know about your experience in big organizations, but in mine, getting 7 vice presidents to agree on anything is pretty hard. So it took a long time, but once we figured out the competency around doing it and got people comfortable with it, we did a lot of it. And by the time I left Iron Mountain, we were buying a terawatt hour a year of clean energy, mostly under various contract structures, and all of it at or below market pricing, right? and with firm fixed pricing. So I think the change in thinking about moving the electricity procurement from out of sight to a strategic buy is the thing. And I'm sorry I sound like a broken record on that. Let me throw in one last comment there. There's a whole lot of stuff in your electricity portfolio, in your energy portfolio, that ought to be or will be electric. So get a handle on the rest of your data. How much fuel does your organization buy for trucks and vehicles, et cetera? Do you have a small fleet or even a big fleet? That's going to be electric, and you need to know it now. Your AC, air conditioning, HVAC systems are probably going to get upgraded or changed. You may be heating with natural gas today, or fuel oil, for crying out loud. What happens when that becomes electric? Know that now and understand what the math looks like so that you can anticipate what's going to be electric in your portfolio. All of those folks are about to come to your door with problems, and that's going to be a great opportunity for you to have the answers. Denise, welcome back. Yay.
Welcome back. Yeah. Kevin, that's great advice, right? Is not just thinking about electricity today, but thinking about energy from your organization more holistically, and how that sort of forecasts into the future. I think the other part that I hear in your response there, and we have another question that came across, but is essentially, your anecdote there with the 7 vice presidents. It's getting that first win, right? Getting that first win is not always simple. As a matter of fact, it's quite usually the opposite. It's usually the most challenging. And so, but once you get that first win, and you know that you and your trusted advisors and whoever you're working with have put together essentially the due diligence to make sure that it's of value to the organization, then you can stack those wins, right? And it becomes sort of compound interest and momentum surges. So
it's just like Denise was saying, get that first win on the board, and then you're off to the races.
Exactly right. Okay, I think we have another question here. So what are the key points that maybe unstuck the process as you were trying to get projects over the line? So in getting that first win, as we just sort of outlined, right, it can be the most challenging. Denise, did you experience any or I shouldn't say did you, what types of roadblocks did you experience, and what was able to really sort of grease the wheels to get it past that hurdle?
Uh-oh. Can she hear us?
Possibly not.
Online this time. I apologize for that.
Maybe I'll go to Kevin.
But
wait.
For us, a number of things were really. Can you hear me?
Better now.
Maybe not.
Not that well. Sorry.
Okay.
For everyone out there, Denise is traveling today, so as we all know, the world of Wi-Fi on travel is never the most reliable. So.
Yeah. In fact, thank you
I'm
for
gonna
making the effort.
maybe take my camera. I'm going to take my camera off, so maybe that'll help with the transmission, and you'll at least be able to hear the sound.
Much better.
So in my experience, the financial components are always very impactful. So you need to be able to show the benefit versus cost ratio of the work that you're doing. And there are, again, many compliance rules that you have to understand in order to meet these expectations, and working with the correct business partners can help you with those particular items. Also, I would say that understanding the contracting component, because you can have a great deal, but if you can't get a contract completed, the deal isn't going anywhere either. So understanding that contracting side is equally important. And then wherever possible, if you can take advantage of either state funded incentives or utility funded incentives, the utilities are in the same boat. And if you can make them your partner in some of these items and help work through the incentives to improve the deployment of these items, we like to think about them as stackable incentives. So you put in your rooftop solar array, but then you also can potentially participate in a distributed energy program or a power sellback program if you don't use 100% of what you've put on your grid, and or you have the opportunity to participate in renewable energy certificate sales or purchases. And so there's many different ways to think about these, but if you can stack the benefit to show that it's not just about your greenhouse gas reduction, that you're actually reducing cost, and to really partner with the business, maybe with a target customer. Some of those are the easiest ways to then make sure that you have, it's not just yourself advocating for the change and why you need to make the change, but you have other parties that can also carry that message forward.
That's fantastic, Denise. Thank you. And being mindful of time, I wanted to thank you, Kevin, you, Denise, both for joining us and giving us a wealth of information on your experience and how you both have helped navigate sort of businesses in forward thinking, right, with our energy needs. Thank you to everyone who attended. And so appreciate everyone's time today in navigating the dynamic sort of environment that we're in. I think the key takeaway is that the only constant is sort of change. Things are going to be dynamic and volatile. It just varies what those catalysts are. But there are options out there, and it's going to be the most forward-thinking, proactive organizations that sort of move into the next 5 to 10 years with being able to control what they need to from an energy procurement perspective. So thank you, everybody.